been the ruling elite who had very little time for the sort of Appalachian whites, with the basically subsistence farmers in the upcountry. And the reason that the taxpayer rhetoric worked so well is because Reconstruction governments had to raise taxes, and they'd had to raise them quite a lot, because they were trying to achieve something genuinely extraordinary. Not only were they rebuilding states that were in physical ruin, but they were building for the first time a public school system. And not just for the first time a public school system for Black children, but in most of these states, the first public school system for white children. And so they just needed a lot of money. And so they had to raise land taxes, and it helps give us a wedge issue to the plantation elite.
Well,
and in fact, go on.
Yeah, and it fascinated me too how quick the shift was from overt racism. So you talked about the year 1868. They were in South Carolina talking about how the superior race is made to be subservient to the inferior, and then within 4 years, they are talking about how they're essentially colorblind, and this is all about taxpayers. How quickly was that able to resonate with the poorer whites that you're talking about? Because it seems like such a massive shift from extreme racism to just couched racism, which we still see today.
Yeah, I mean, it was an impressive, I think the first thing to recognize is how impressive it was that rural upcountry whites were willing to vote with the Black majority. I mean, racism had been so deeply embedded into that society. And, what you see in Republican newspapers at the time, the Republican Party being the party of Lincoln and therefore the party of emancipation and freedom, the Republican papers at the time calling on poor white farmers to put aside the question of color and make sure that the rebels did not come back into power, and that was working, but it wasn't given much of an opportunity, not only because plantation whites quickly organized actual paramilitary mobs to keep elections from happening, but also because they were able to appeal to poor white voters who genuinely had seen their taxes gone up, and not the way people complain about their taxes going up today, where it's an inconvenience. We're talking about subsistence level farmers who are really struggling. So they found a wedge issue, and it worked within only 2 or 3 years.
Why was that appeal to vote against the rebels so or to vote in such a way that the rebels are still, sort of, I guess, subjugated? Why was that so resonant with these subsistence farmers?
In the South, plantation owners liked to pretend that slavery freed every white man from having to work. The reality was it wasn't true. It made a couple of white people exceptionally rich and, of course, oppressed an entire race of people. But if you weren't a slave owner, you had almost no chance of having any serious amount of wealth. There was no middle class in the American white South. So, and because you were competing both politically and economically with people who literally didn't pay their workforce, there was no way to get ahead. And everyone knew, and this was a big fear before the war too, that if the Appalachian whites ever came to power, they would vote for abolition by taxation. This is one of the reasons why Southern states try so hard, not only to limit democracy at a federal level, but in their states as well. They knew that slavery, even if they didn't feel a moral compunction about what was happening to Black people, they knew that it wasn't in their interest for there to be this aristocratic overclass. So there was longstanding tension between the people closer to the coast with the richer land, large plantations and hundreds of slaves, and then people farther inland who, wanted basic public services, wanted to have the kind of, free land that you could get in the West, that the independence that was possible for a northern farmer.
Was there any type of resentment that we had just gone through this war for not my interests, essentially, and at least a significant amount of the suffering fell upon a group of people who had really nothing to win in this war?
Absolutely. And one of the, people forget now, but I mean, the reason West Virginia is a state is right, because the mountainous upcountry of Virginia didn't want to do this war, right? And they knew that they didn't want to fight for slavery and for the slaveholders and their wealth. But not everyone who was in, the poorer lands in the upcountry were directly connected to the North, right? Not everyone could do what West Virginia did. But that sentiment existed in many parts of the South.
I'm curious, and this is a little bit off topic, but how that developed. So, maybe we should circle back to that, because They are enticed at the idea. The anger they have at this point is, wow, there's a tremendous amount of taxation relative to what we have for these services, because it's very costly, particularly to get these things up and running when you theoretically the economy in these areas has been devastated. Not only has the infrastructure been devastated, but presumably, like, there has to be new economic models too, that because they had so heavily relied on, like you say, on free labor, and so how does that develop? They within a couple short years, they developed this notion of like a I guess the taxpayers convention, right? In Charleston. Walk us through that.
So I got to tell you about the people who ran the Taxpayers Convention, because they are the most Confederate Confederates that ever confederated. They literally, the leaders included the first senator to leave the Senate after Abraham Lincoln's election. It includes a guy who is the first cousin and grew up in the same household with Preston Brooks. Now, this is a deep cut from American history, but this is the guy who beat Charles Sumner nearly to death on the Senate floor. This is his cousin. And the other guy literally refused to surrender at Appomattox. So if you knew who these people were, it should have been obvious to you that they have not really surrendered and have not committed themselves to this new multiracial democracy. But they organized themselves as this taxpayers convention, first in 1871, and then they re-meet in 1874. And it's very clear from their earliest meeting that they recognize the problem is that if Black people can vote, they're never going to hold power again, right? And so that's the problem. They're facing this universal suffrage that they would like to destroy. They test various ideas. They talk a little bit about maybe we can convince white people to move to the South, or maybe we can have a sort of proportional system of voting, but they say themselves this would only be half a loaf when they deserve the whole thing. So what they end up doing is producing these taxpayer leagues, right? And they organize them across South Carolina. The same idea is picked up across the South. And these taxpayer leagues are sort of the midpoint, I would say, between the Democratic Party, which was the party of the white ruling class of the South, and the genuine paramilitary groups, the sort of Ku Klux Klan, red shirts. The taxpayer leagues were sort of in the middle. They had more legitimacy. They weren't as obviously organized exclusively around voter suppression, but they played the same role. And so what you see is these groups, on the one hand, making very sober statements about local budgets and how they've doubled, now that we have to rebuild after war instead of an entire school system. Amazingly, the budget, it's larger, and this is unacceptable. So they're making these very sober claims that you'd recognize from sort of politics today, the sort of austerity politics talk. In the meantime, they're actually organizing paramilitary groups. They're working with groups like the Red Shirts to first resist taxation, and second, at the point of the gun, push Black lawmakers out of office.
And the reason that the budget had doubled was because the infrastructure had been decimated in the war, and there was also a massive increase in the amount of taxpayers, right? Because of all of the freed Black people after the war. I mean, that's the reason behind that, right?
Yeah, the population, as South Carolina understood it, doubled, right? And it actually left Reconstruction governments in a terrible bind, because what they wanted to do was to be able to tax the slaveholder class. Well, now everyone was free, so you couldn't tax them as precisely as you could have before the war. So you're stuck with these land taxes if you're not going to do land reform. And land reform was too, the idea of just literally dividing up plantations and giving them to the people who had been forced to work on them, that was too extreme, too radical for the time. And so they're trapped trying to figure out how to raise the kind of money they need in an economy that's been decimated when they have twice as many people to look after.
So what was the means of taxing? I just want to remind people that we don't have an income tax for another 50 years almost from this time, more or less, right? In the 19 teens, we get the income tax. So how did they tax at this time if it wasn't?
So there are two kinds of taxes to recognize that were sort of prominent in Southern politics at the time. The first thing to know, though, is that the slaveholder class had kept the taxing capacity of the Southern states in ruins. They literally didn't value the state, like it couldn't value things. So they taxed land by the acre. They didn't tax it whether depending how good the land was. So if you're upcountry, you're paying at the same rate as someone who has like the fancy land that's particularly rich and where the plantations were. So there was no infrastructure in place to make it possible to apply taxes really carefully. And they were building that too. The idea of valuing property at all was a radical change over what had been possible before the war. So their land taxes is the one main thing. And you see the sort of radical Black legislators across the South talking about land taxes as a way, not just to raise money that they desperately needed to build these schools, but also as a way to force plantation owners to sell their property, right? That they wouldn't be able to pay the tax and they could sell the property and then perhaps freedmen could buy it. That was the dream. So land taxes are one. The other thing was poll taxes. And, Reconstruction governments, you see in the legislatures them debating this. They worried that poll taxes could be used to disenfranchise people. But at the same time, they wanted everyone to chip in because they knew that the public school system, especially for Black children, would come under attack right away. So they wanted to make sure that families were chipping in. And one of the things that you see, as Jim Crow solidifies in the decades that follow, is how hard Black communities worked when they were getting their tax dollars just stripped out of their communities, right? To continue to raise money on a voluntary basis to keep those schools open.
Interesting. And liquor was taxed too at this point too, right? I mean that I imagine must have also created a certain amount of resent.
Yes, in particular, that was not that. That dates back all the way to the Whiskey Rebellion. It's hard to imagine today, but money is actually scarce in rural communities at this time. So paying a tax is hard in part because you actually have to get your hands on money, which is not always available. And so the upcountry whites, not only did they not particularly want to pay taxes on whiskey simply because taxes on whiskey hit at a product they were very fond of. But whiskey was often used in a form of barter. You could get paid in whiskey. You could pay your rent in whiskey in a lot of these communities. So when you're putting a tax on alcohol, which, in the cities seems like we're basically, this is a sin tax, this is a tax on a luxury good that you don't really need. It is actually really hitting at people's wages and people's, the sort of fundament of their economy. So yeah, the tax on liquor is often an extremely volatile subject.
So, so you write that ultimately, faced with an estimated 60,000 taxpayers and 90,000 voters who pay no taxes, which is reminiscent of Mitt Romney's takers and makers and 47%ers. They settle on three means. They bring the poor whites to their side via this taxation. They intimidate Black voters, and they reclaim power in the state by any means necessary, which is, of course, the pushing, the KKK, but also a series of massacres that really take place. I mean, the Wilmington Massacre. You talk about the Vicksburg Massacre. I mean, these are happening. They're literally just taking out Black people from the government, essentially, like literally, all very reminiscent of things that have happened in the past week, frankly, in some respects. But so we move on from there. The strategy works, and then what happens? I mean, you cite something that I find just fascinating from an economist, Trevor Logan, finds that public finance was directly related to the I'm going to quote your piece for you, if you don't mind. Directly related to the strength of the violent reaction to Reconstruction. The chances of a local politician being attacked increased 3 percentage points for each additional dollar per capita of tax revenue collected in 1870. That's just extraordinary that you can find that type of relationship between the tax, the resent about taxes, and then how that resent is carried out on Black politicians. Yeah.
So what happened in Vicksburg in Mississippi is a good example of this phenomenon. What you see is that tax day comes and the local sheriff, who is the tax collector, is Black. And you've got to remember what an absolute revolution had occurred here. We're talking about, when tax collectors were African American, and a fair number of them were among the government officials that came in the Reconstruction period. What you're talking about is for a slaveholder, sometimes someone would come to his property and on behalf of the government and say he had the right to value that property and to impose a tax. That's someone he used to think he owned. This is an extraordinary social revolution that's occurred. So what happens in Vicksburg, the sheriff is, it's tax day, he's supposed to collect the taxes. A white militia comes and doesn't just refuse to pay the taxes,